Hello my crafty friends, this is Monica from Allsewpetite. Welcome back to my channel. This is the last video of this series where I walk you through how to make the McFly backpack. Link to the pattern and all supplies I used in this tutorial can be found in the description box below. We have assembled the lining and external pieces of the pattern, and all we have left is to put them all together. So let's get sewing. Now that we have assembled the entire gusset, go ahead and find the midpoints along that gusset. So you're going to fold the gusset in half, line up those seams, then you can just snip a little triangle at the end. Do that both on the external fabric and the lining fabric, and then repeat on the other side. Now you can take the front panel, and if you haven't done so already, again mark those midpoints along the top edge and the bottom edge of the front panel. Then with right sides together, you're going to place that entire gusset on top of the front and line up around that curved edge. So don't worry about the bottom seam at the moment, we're going to work around those curved edges. So match the center notches and then clip that in place. Alright, then you can bring the bottom edge of your side panel and line it up at the bottom edge of your front piece. Make sure you keep the lining out of the way. So you want to fold the lining on top of the zipper, so you keep it out of the way, because you don't want to clip the lining. You're only clipping the external fabric, and then just finish lining up the gusset around the curve. If you have to, it might be easier, especially around the curved corners here, if you snip the gusset slightly, about maybe 5 millimeters, into the seam allowance. This way the fabric stretches a little bit and it's easier to lay it flat, and you see how easier it is to line it up around that curve. So you just clip that as well in place. And then we're going to repeat that on this side. Now when you're ready, you're going to sew the seam using 1 centimeter seam allowance. Again, make sure you keep your side pockets and the lining pieces out of the way. You don't want to stitch through the lining pieces or your pockets. At this point it might be easier to open the zipper, the top zipper panel, and stitch the seam with the zipper opened. Once you've stitched the seam, you can just flip it over to the right side just to double check if you're happy with everything, if you don't have any pucker rings or pleats, especially around the top curved corners. And if you're happy with everything, go ahead and trim the stabilizer out of the seam allowance, same way we've done on darts. You can flip the backpack right side out. Keep the lining out of the way and line up those side pockets along the bottom edge and the gusset. Now we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to baste our side pockets along the bottom edge and the sides using 5mm seam allowance. We're going to take the lining front panel and we're going to attach it to the lining gusset exactly the same way we've done for the external piece. So to do that, you're going to have to flip everything back to how it was, to the wrong side, so it's easier for us to line it up. So match the midpoints first, then take the lining side panel and line it up at the bottom edge of the front piece and the side. Now we're going to line up the rest of the gusset around the panel. So again, if you want, you can just snip it around the curved corner so it's easier for you to line it up. There you go. And then line it up. So again, you want to keep the lining and external separately, so you're only clipping the lining pieces now. This might be one of those more fiddly parts of the pattern, especially where the zipper casing ends and meets the side panels, because there is not much room. I found that the clips tend to move, and this way my fabric shifts a little bit. So to prevent that, what I like to do instead of using a clip at this point, I take my stapler and I just staple it inside the seam allowance, just like that. So instead of using a clip here, I just staple it in a couple of places. This way I know my fabric is secure. Now we're going to take this to the machine, and again we're going to sew the seam using 1cm seam allowance. Again, make sure you keep the external fabric out of the way. You don't want to stitch for the external pieces. We're only stitching the lining. If you want your backpack lining to fit more snugly inside your backpack, you can slightly increase the seam allowance at the sides to maybe 1/2 inch or 12 to 15mm. Use 1 centimeter around the zipper casing as it is. From that seam, you can increase the seam allowance slightly going towards the bottom. This where the lining will be slightly smaller than the external panel, and it will fit more snugly inside the backpack. For me, it's not that big of a deal, so I'm going to stick to 1 centimeter seam allowance around the entire panel. Okay, now that we've stitched the lining to the gusset, we're going to attach the lining zipper casing to the external zipper casing. This way, when we turn the backpack to the right side, the lining will be securely attached to the external pieces, which will prevent the lining from being saggy inside the backpack. To do this, you're going to take your lining and zipper casing and you're going to bring them together and clip it. And then do that on the other side as well. Bring those seams together, align it at the edges and clip that. And then continue clipping it together around the entire zipper casing. So you're going to have to push the zipper inside around the curved edges. Now we're going to take this to the machine. We're going to stitch maybe about 2 millimeters away from that original stitching line, around that curved corner, top and the other curved corner. You're going to stitch through all the layers to anchor the lining to the external panel. We're going to trim the seam allowance at the curve. Okay, once you've got that, you're going to turn the backpack right side out. Alright, grab your external back piece and we're going to line it up along the other side of the gusset. So again, keep your straps, your handles out of the way, match the midpoints and only clip it to the external fabric, so keep the lining out of the way as well. There we go, just like that. Again, we're going to sew the seam using 1 centimeter seam allowance. And make sure you keep your lining pieces out of the way. You only want to stitch through the external fabric. Go ahead and remove the stabilizer from the seam allowance, and then we're going to attach the back lining to the gusset. Going to keep that out of the way, and right side facing each other. You're going to match the midpoints, then line up the side panel. If you decided to increase the seam allowance when sewing the front lining piece, then repeat the process at this point and increase the seam allowance as well on the back lining. Otherwise, just sew the entire seam using 1 centimeter seam allowance. After you've stitched that seam, you're going to do the same thing as we did on the front. which means we're going to stitch the lining and the external zipper casings together. So again, you're going to line up those side seams and clip them in place on both sides. And then continue clipping around the entire zipper casing. Again, you're going to have to push the zipper inside and just line up the seam allowance together. Again, we're going to stitch along the zipper casing just behind the original stitching line, so about 2 millimeters away from the original stitching line. We're going to stitch through all the layers around that curved top edge. Once again, we're going to trim the seam allowance around that top curved edge. Now we need to find the midpoints along the side panels. So bring the lining front and back together, match those midpoints, line them up like this, so you can find the midpoint on the side. You can just clip it a little bit on one side and then do the same thing on the other side. Here we go. And then we're going to repeat that on the external pieces as well. Once you've got the midpoints on each side, you're going to take your external base panel and we're going to match those 4 midpoints with the midpoints on your base panel. So the longer edges needs to match the front and the back, and the rounded edges will match the sides. So I'm going to first match my midpoints on all sides. Again, keep the lining out of the way so you don't pin it at this point. You just want to pin the external fabric. Okay, now that I have 4 midpoints matched, it's going to be easier to align the rest of the base along the entire backpack. You can snip the backpack around the bottom panel, so it's easier for you to line up around the curved edges. Otherwise, just carry on slowly pinning around the entire panel. Now we're going to stitch around the base using 1 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure you don't have any pucker rings. Then if you're happy with everything, go ahead and trim the seam allowance. Okay, now that I'm ready, I'm going to use the opening in the bottom of the lining to turn my backpack right side out. I've got my backpack turned right side out. We are nearly done. Now you can open your zipper pocket. Then we're going to pull the lining outside of the backpack through the opening in our zipper pocket. You're going to take your lining base and then with right sides together, clip the base to the bottom of our lining. So again, you're going to match 4 notches like we've done for the external panel, and then you can clip the base all around. Alright, I've got my base panel clipped to the bottom edge of my lining. Now I'm going to sew the seam using 1 centimeter seam allowance. If in previous steps you increased your seam allowance around the side panels for the lining, your base panel at this point will be a little bit too big. So you can either trim it off slightly around the curves to match the overall circumference of the bottom edge of the lining, or you can just increase seam allowance to maybe like a ½ inch or 12 to 15 millimeters, depending on how much you took at the sides. Okay, once you've stitched the base to the lining, you're going to trim the seam allowance. Now you can insert the lining back into the backpack. And last step is to close the opening in the lining. So pull the pocket lining out of the backpack. Then you're going to line up those folded edges. Use some clips to hold them in place. Okay, and then we can just stitch close to the edge, about 2 millimeters from the edge, to close the opening in the bottom edge of the pocket. Phew! I know this project wasn't the easiest one, but we made it through. Which size did you make? The mini one or the regular one? I would love to hear what you think about the McFly backpack, so leave a comment in the comment section below. Also like this video if you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you would like to see more videos like this one in the future, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you next time. Stay crafty, friends.